When they get back, we will usher them up here very quickly to take their seats and join the panel. After the panel, we have breakout sessions again, just so you know where to go. Media and messaging will be in the Europe room, and Opt-out 101 will stay in this room, and then resisting charter takeovers will go in North America. So we'll make that announcement again at the end, but just so you have an idea. And thanks. I'll leave it to Dave to take over.
I got to put this up here. Thank you, Denisha. My name's Dave Green. I've been involved in all of this stuff since back in the summer of 2011 when SOS March created that rallying conference that had 7,500 people that nobody knew about except those of us who were there. Except for the one thing that Matt Damon showed up, and all of a sudden it was news, or newsworthy. At any rate, because we want to leave enough time for those of you in the audience to be able to participate in the discussion. You can tell that's the teacher part of me. We're going to try to keep our comments as brief as possible and hopefully be able to answer any questions that you have, but hopefully you can answer the questions from amongst you rather than having a one-on-one kind of thing, have a more Socratic kind of conversation with people within the audience. So the topic is the global privatization and the advancing endgame result. Bess, Kevin Reese and the Rosa brothers will be with us. Morna McDermott could not be here. Her mom is ill. And Jaisal Noor, who's a journalist, could not be here because he took ill this morning and decided he did not want to track cars as he was coming up here. Probably good for all of us. At any rate, it's important for us to broaden our horizons as we deal with education policy issues and to see how children are being affected, not just now, but for the last 30 years, because of global economic/education policies. Today's education policymakers are not that different from the education policymakers of a century ago. A century ago, they were turning out students in what they called common schools, not public schools. The phrase was actually common schools, to become cogs in factories for people like Ford, General Motors, and the industrial giants of the industrial age. Today, it's the post-industrial age that they are churning out these workers for at low wages and to be basically able to follow orders, while those who go to the private schools are still being taught, just as they were 100 years ago, how to be leaders and to critically think and to discuss. Two different sets of curricula. And this is not new. It is based upon a theory of scientific management that was written by Frederick Taylor in the early 20th century. It was basically used not just by corporations, but by schools, states, and districts all across the country to produce workers for that particular economic age. Back in the 1980s, you all remember a Nation at Risk? Well, some of you remember. Some of you were not born yet. 1983 document, which basically started the trend to tell us how bad we all were. At that point, the new corporate leadership realized that, well, let's see, airlines are taken, railroads are taken, electronics are taken. What's the next big industry we can exploit and take over? And when a Nation at Risk came out, they realized, oh my goodness, there it is. It's called education. So shortly after that, and again, if you haven't read, I'll name drop too, everybody else seems to be doing it. Pasi Salver, former education leader in Finland, wrote a book 3 or 4 years ago called Finnish Lessons. I highly recommend it because basically what they tell you is that the Finnish education system, ranked #1, and even excluding the issue of poverty, basically is what it is because it took many of the educational practices that we had developed in the 60s and 70s and made them nationwide policy. The very same policies that now are being extinguished by our corporate, Fed-led ed leaders. So the organization that he describes is called GERM, a perfect expression for it. It was the Global Education Reform Movement, which was coupled with the Global Economic Reform Movement. So it emerged in the 80s, was sort of finalized in the 90s, and basically it is the cancer that has spread that we've heard from Stephen last night and Chris this morning, and I'm sure you'll hear many of the other panels and comments we'll hear during the rest of the day. It's promoted through the interest of international development and private enterprises through their interventions in national economic, educational reforms and policy formation. And they have 5 globally agreed upon principles that all signing nations pledged to put into practice. By the way, the only nation not to sign that agreement? Finland. So, these are the 5. They should sound very familiar. Number 1, standardization of education. Number 2, a focus on core subjects. 3, the search for quote-unquote low-risk ways to reach learning goals. Low risk is translated into no, profitable.
Very low cost.
And 4th, the use of corporate management models. And 5th, the adaptation of test-based accountability policies. That was developed in the early 1990s. That's how long they've been working on this. Now, what we want to do is to bring that short version of history, I teach history, that's why I kind of brought it up that way, and bring it into the present so that you can now see, and we've already heard this before, now see how this private globalization, this economic trend to have these trade agreements, which buried in the language of the trade agreements or some of these other agreements we're talking about. And our speakers are going to direct your attention to particular focuses that they have. And first we'll hear from Kevin, and then we hope we'll hear from the Rosa brothers, and then Bess, who has some ideas about how to take action about it. So Kevin, please.
We have one of the Rosa brothers.
How you all doing? Thank you for getting back. Thank you for getting back from lunch so quickly.
Where's Ricardo?
I'm going to. Well, first of all, my name is Kevin Zeese, and I'm with co-director of Cognitive Resistance. The other directors up here, Margaret Flowers, and we focus on movements around the world and the nation to show that people are fighting back. And we also have about a 5-year campaign to stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership, stop the TPP, that we've been running through a group called, a project called Flush the TPP. And I can tell a story about that, how we got that name later, but I don't have much time. I'm going to try to stick it to 5 minutes, because I really want to have the dialogue. That's the most important part of these kinds of events, and it doesn't get enough attention to do, so hopefully I won't go over on that. I want to talk just about a few things. First, United Opt-out and your allies are at the center of the epic battle of our times. It's the battle between corporate power and people power. Who is going to make decisions? Are we going to have them made for us by corporations? Often corporations from outside the country even. Corporations that have no allegiance to the country or are transnational, make their money overseas. Or are we going to rule by ourselves? And this is not a battle that's only at the state level, only at the local level or at the federal level. It's an international battle. And we're going to focus on the international in this session. I'm going to focus on 2 current treaties that are being fought and are being negotiated. How many people have heard of Occupy UGC? It's a very important movement out of India, and Occupy UGC ran from last October to January, and it focused on cuts that were being made to the university budgets in India. And they were being made in preparation for essentially making India's universities more privatized and open to marketers, education marketers from outside the country. And in order to do that, they had to begin to lower the state expenditures in education, because under treaties, you can't give special privilege to public education. Any outside agency that comes in that's going to teach, set up a university in India, would have to get the same benefits as the public university. And so that just starts a downward spiral in public involvement. And so tens of thousands of youth and academics protested this, and they protested around the meeting of the WTO GATS the general agreement on trade and services. Education is a service, and that's been a battle that's been going on for years. India's agreed to open up their country to education marketers, and so the people are fighting back and saying no. So often it takes a little bit of time for people to understand what these treaties are doing, and I think they've been fighting that GATS now for years and installing it, and happily say it still has not been finalized. They wanted to finalize it years ago, and they haven't succeeded. People fighting back actually does make a difference. We actually can win, even when we're fighting against these immense powers, these transnational corporate powers that often have more money than governments do. We can win. We've seen that in the United States as well. The other agreement I want to mention in my short introduction here is one that President Obama is negotiating. People have heard of the TPP now, finally. It took us years for that to happen. Their strategy was keep it secret, because as people know about it, they'll oppose it. Some people know about the transatlantic agreement that's also being negotiated, which is having its problems in Europe because people are fighting back there. Hundreds of thousands of people coming to protests in Germany, a million people signing petitions. Major fight back from people is slowing that one down. And so that one may not get negotiated during Obama's tenure. The one I want to talk about, though, is the one that probably most people have not heard of, which is TISA, the Trade in Services Agreement. Trade in Services Agreement. And this is the one that will hit education most directly, because education is a service. And TISA is the largest of these agreements, the 3 agreements that Obama is pushing. It is 50 nations. And the overall thrust of it is to privatize and commodify. Everything gets privatized and commodified. They want, the Postal Service, very likely not to survive if TISA becomes law. Because privatizing, it's a one-way street, by the way. Once you privatize, you're not allowed to go back. And so if you go that direction, you are stuck in that direction. And they, of course, want to do that to health services, as we see with Obamacare. It's totally adding to privatization, giving insurance companies more power, giving pharmaceuticals more power, giving health insurance agencies more involvement in both Medicaid and Medicare, the public services. And so that's part of that same ideology of privatize our human rights, commodify things that should be public goods. And TISA does that as well for a whole range of services, including education. Now, TISA came out, started negotiating that with Australia and the United States actually started it. And it developed because the GATS is not getting resolved. They can't get agreement on the GATS, and so they go the route of a backdoor route of TISA. TPP and the TTIP from Europe are kind of backdoors to the WTO being stalled. And so they're just coming at us from different directions with the same goal. And so they hope to actually have completed the negotiation on TISA in 2014. So they're having challenges. And this is the one they're keeping secret best. This is the one I think that groups like Opt Out should really focus on. There have been some leaks. You can find them on WikiLeaks. You can find them on our website, popularresistance.org, or on our TPP campaign, flushthetpp.org. We've republished those leaks there, and you can find information about them there. But the leaks basically show exactly what I'm describing to you. Total privatization. Public services are the evil. And this is true both in the European and the TPP as well. They deal with other, now services are 80% of our economy. So it's
Kev, 1 minute.
Thanks. This is the biggest and the most impactful of the agreements that Obama is negotiating, and it's the least known. So I really want to urge you to look at TISA, understand it, and put out some statements, plan some protests. Let's start to put this on the radar. It takes a lot of work to overcome the corporate media. Let me just finalize and say, I think our goal at this time in our history is to really push back hard on privatization and reverse privatization. We need to start to not only stop the evils of these kinds of trade agreements and a similar kind of policies at the state, local, and federal levels. We need to start to reverse them and put forward what we see, what we want. And so when we defeat the TPP, and we're going to defeat the TPP, and when the land agreement is stopped, and it's going to be stopped, we want to then reverse our direction and push for what we want in trade, and that is people and planet first. We want to see human rights talked about again. This has been a long time battle. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights you know, goes back to Eleanor Roosevelt. We need to put those realities in place. Those include right to education, right to housing, right to healthcare. All those issues are there, so it's a time to push for human rights, it's a time to push for public good, and recognize that as a transparent, a more transparent democracy, a real democracy, we can do better than the corporations. Thank you all very much.
And as you said, we're cutting our talks short so we can have questions and discussion later. So, you know, take good notes so you can ask good questions. We're going to ask the Rosa brothers to come up in tandem. We don't want any sibling rivalry for who gets more time. So we're going to let them figure it out on their own when they're up here. But they will get a little extra time than a single speaker. Ricardo, where are you hiding?
Just trying to get away from doing this thing. I would actually be very amenable to just sitting down and having you talk. It's fine. But you know, very hard acts to follow. I think in both instances, in the morning speaker as well as right now. I think I can only give you a glimpse of globalization coming from my particular location. And very, very quickly, I'm going to tell you that I come from a very small country in the west coast of Africa called Cape Verde. And some of you were in the talk that I did earlier, so you heard a little bit about the situation in Cape Verde. I have a tendency to rely on particular people when I start talking about education, and I'm reminded of a quote by Stephen Biko who says that the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. When the Portuguese left Cape Verde, basically the literacy rate was astoundingly low. It's no surprise because the Portuguese really wanted to develop a class of functionaries to help control the rest of Africa, quote unquote, Lusophone Africa. But so the literacy rates were extremely low. After independence, the single party government came in and did massive investments in public education, K-12 education particularly. I mean, so much so that in the 2000s, what you have is a country that had no high schools to begin with, now is asking for the building of public universities because there was so much investment done in public education. At the moment, I'm going to tell you the situation of Cape Verde, and I'm going to go back a little bit. At the moment, a country, Cape Verde, that got independence in 1975, does not own its own water. The water is owned by foreign investors. It does not own telecommunications. It's owned by foreign investors. It does not own its major banks. They're owned by foreign investors. It does not own electricity. They're owned by foreign investors. And all of this stuff only came in after 1991 when a neoliberal model government came into power and liberalized the economy, right? And as you're mentioning TISA, I think that for Cape Verde, when you look at the Millennium Challenge account grants that were given out by the current administration to some African countries, they've basically decimated the public sector. The model of good governance really means open markets and transparency, and what that means is you decimate the public sector, open up everything to competition, so you have all sorts of schools popping up everywhere, and the public education that was the last refuge of the poor, right? After so many revolutions in Africa, public education and healthcare are now the fields that are being privatized to the max. And of course, you know, the population is, those who pay the costs of this thing. And I think that one of the things that, we need to focus on is the way that at an international level, the types of benchmarks, tests that are given out across countries in this type of competition, and the way that stuff, both what's happening nationally here affects some of that stuff and how that stuff affects local populations. It's a travesty. I mean, what's happening in Cape Verde is an absolute travesty in terms of globalization. I'll give you just one more quick example. I know we don't have a lot of time, but On the island of Sal and on the island of Boa Vista in Cape Verde, right now there are hotel resorts, some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. You know, so hotels have come in, set up shop, resorts. They have self-contained packages. So you can buy a package in England, you can buy a package in Ireland or whatnot, and go visit Cape Verde and spend your entire time inside of this resort, right? And what it has done is it has decimated local economies. It decimates local economies. You have a rise in criminality, a rise in teenage prostitution, because the tourists that go there, it increases the poverty, right? And as it increases the poverty, the tourists that go there, they get consolidated inside of these little resorts. They get taken out in buses to specific spots and get brought right back to the resort, so they don't get to interact with folks in the local. And what it does is it decimates the local population, the local economy, and you have all sorts of side effects to that. So from my perspective, in a sense, I'm glad that I am among friends, among people who, because I look at this thing as an ideological thing, you know, people who challenge some of these same issues. But I can tell you this, that it's impossible to make radical changes here without effectively taking on the challenges that people have all over.
That's right.
Without making those ones. It's impossible. It doesn't matter if it's in Puerto Rico, if it's in Mexico, if it's in Cape Verde or Mali. I mean, the issue is that we need to make these links across borders. Because in the end, it's an issue of capital, right? And if you can't challenge it, then you lose the war. You know? But thank you very much.
Ricardo, you're up.
We really sound alike, so. Now, I don't really have much to say. I'm going to keep it really short because what happened was in our last panel, my brother opened up the conversation about Cape Verde, and that's what I was scheduled to talk about as well. So he said pretty much a lot of what I was going to say. But I guess, I mean, I think, you know, the major focus, it's mind-boggling to me that, you know, our discussions are so national, you know, so sort of centered in the nation state, in the United States. And the reality is that a lot of what's driving U.S. education and standardization, the whole standardization movement in the United States is actually international benchmarks, right? So we're really not paying attention to that and how these tests are actually driving national systems, and we need to, you know. We also need to pay real close attention to the forms of resistance that are going on across the globe. I mean, we're resisting the test here, and you have people in Chile doing the same exact thing, and people in Mexico doing the same exact thing and getting killed for it. And the forms of resistance, I mean, obviously, you know, each context will present different opportunities for contestation, right? But it's very important for us to pay attention to the ways that folks in Mexico are resisting and seizing sort of knowledge about aspects of what they're doing that we can also implement in certain contexts here in the United States. So I'll keep it, I mean, we need to pay attention to all of these players. You know, on the international scene, you have global international organizations like the OECD and the World Bank. We have NGOs, global non-governmental organizations, and you also have the state, right, that's also responsible for deregulation and opening up spaces for these other entities to work in their system. We also have education businesses that are operating across boundaries. You know, Pearson is not just the U.S. Pearson is effectively taking over Mexico and so many other places. You know, we need to pay real close attention to that. And so that's, you know, I don't have much to say on this, but as my brother mentioned, we don't live in a country, we live in an empire. It's always important to keep that in mind. You cannot, as Mark Twain once said, have democracy at home and have empire abroad. Makes no sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Hi there. I'm Bess Altwerger. The last name gets creamed all the time. Don't worry about it. I'm just Bess.
Never mind.
I'm one of the co-founders of Save Our Schools. And there are other co-founders here in this room. Jesse Turner is here somewhere. Dave Green was working with us.
Anthony's back there.
Anthony Cody is here somewhere. The reason that we created, developed Save Our Schools was because we had this recognition that there were pockets of resistance going on all over the country. But people thought they were alone. They felt alienated. They didn't realize at that time that this was a national oppression. This was something that was going on all across the country, that it was a concerted effort that was going to affect all of us. And we needed to recognize that we had to work together to bring about any kind of change. We needed a national movement. And I'm glad to say that in 2011, as Dave mentioned, when we came to DC, many people met each other from across the country. They began to realize that we can form allies and alliances with people, and that there was power in that community and in that communication across states and across cities. We are now at the point that we have to realize that this is not just happening in the United States. We are in the belly of the beast, but this is a global assault on children. It's a global assault on human rights, and the human right to an education, the human right to food and water and a decent way of living. And if we're going to be effective in fighting this here, we also have to form those alliances, just like we did across states in this country. We need to form alliances internationally, or else this is not, we're not going to bring it down, because this is a global corporate assault, and we need to see it in that way and fight it in that way. We can't, as I think Ricardo just mentioned, we can't win here without winning globally. This is no longer a matter of national boundaries. This is a global corporate attack. So Save Our Schools, about, I don't know, a year ago or a year and a half ago, launched what we hoped would be the beginning of a campaign against GERM, the Global Education Reform Network. And we were going to try to have a summit. And we actually, with the help of many of the members, including Ricardo sitting right there, were able to contact activists and activist organizations around the world. And we had countries, for example, South Africa, Bangladesh, Brazil, Ghana, Mexico, Pakistan, Palestine, Tanzania. I can go on and on and on. Finding points of contact where we can start building an alliance. And the idea was we were going to have an international summit. I have not given up on that dream. We need to go beyond the national and build an international summit, whether it is in person, online, however we want to do it. But we need to form those alliances. One of the key ways that we thought we could do this is by magnifying the fact that the United States is one of only 2 nations in the United Nations, I think the other one was Somalia, that did not ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. That is an absolute outrage. We should be taking the United States to the World Court for that. There are several articles that, if you think about it, if the United States were to pass, they will never pass this. They will never do this, because if there are some articles in here that they are so guilty of denying. I'll give you a couple. It says that the child, states parties shall assure to the child who is capable of forming his or her own views the right to express those views freely in all matters affecting the child, the views of the child being given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. We're denying that right now in schools with the Common Core and everything else, shutting them up, not giving them the right to speak. The child shall have the right to freedom of expression. There's 2 articles on that. States parties recognize that a mentally or physically disabled child should enjoy a full and decent life in conditions which ensure dignity, promote self-reliance, and facilitate the child's active participation in the community. They shall recognize the right of a child who has been placed by the competent authorities for the purposes of care, protection, or treatment of his or her physical or mental health to a periodic review of the treatment and making sure that their circumstances are dealt with. Parties recognize the right of every child to a standard of living adequate for the child's physical, mental, spiritual, moral, and social development. Can you imagine the United
That's 1
States
minute.
right, accepting that?
About 1 minute.
That's it?
Well,
Okay.
people will come back to you. You'll have...
Last one. States parties recognize the right of the child to education, and with a view to achieving this right progressively and on the basis of equal opportunity. And it goes on and on. What we wanted to do was use as a kind of a tool this convention on the rights of the child as a way to put pressure on the United States here and other countries that have signed on but are not in compliance in the least with this wonderful document. We also wanted to focus on fighting back germ, and part of the initiative was not just an international summit but a national campaign to raise awareness of the fact that we have not signed this declaration, but also raise understanding that the fight that we're fighting here in the United States against the global education reform movement needs to be fought at home as well as abroad. So I'm hoping that we can get some interest in this initiative, that maybe we can start some planning and begin to fight back. Thank you.
Thank you, Bess.
So we actually have about 15 minutes to have some really good discussions, but I'm going to lay a couple of ground rules out. Number 1, your questions cannot be longer than the answers. So keep that in mind, all right? And hopefully, we're going to try to get more discussion with all of you than amongst us, but if you do have a particular question, please try to address it to one of the panelists so they can respond, and then we can have comments and conversation about that, rather than just us dominating from up here. We don't want to make this teacher-centered. We want to make this student-centered. So please keep all of that in mind, and I'll try to moderate as best I can without being totally abusive. So, questions or comments, but again, try to keep it short. Barry.
I just had a quick one. There's a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins.
Good book.
And it's great. He's a whistleblower. He's a guy that worked for the World Bank. And he describes the same thing that the Rosa brothers are talking about from the other side who kind of felt guilty about it after doing this for years. So it's a great read and a great insight.
Thank you, Barry. Next. Don't be shy. Seth.
Kevin Reese, when we go home on Monday morning, what are 3 things that we can do to combat this?
Boom, there's a teacher.
All right, great. It's actually Zeese, as in Z as in zebra. It's okay, it's no big deal. I get called all sorts of names. But three things. I think, first off, look up TISA so this group can begin to take a position on the TISA, Trade and Services Agreement. I think that's the one that's going to affect education most. So educate yourself about that. Second, go to flushthetpp.org, which is our campaign site against trade agreements. We're in this critical moment on fighting the TPP right now. Obama hoped to have had this done more than a year ago. And the fact that we're in election year is making it very hard for him. And so we have a real chance to stop this. In fact, both the Congress, houses of the Congress, the House and Senate, are saying we shouldn't consider this an election year. Sanders is opposed to it, Hillary's opposed to it, Trump is opposed to it, Rubio's waffling on it, Cruz is opposed to it. So there's a lot of opposition in the presidential leadership. So we have a lot of opportunity there. We're planning events, and if you go to the action page on Flush the TPP, you can participate in organizing local ones. We are actually winning this. And so this is can you imagine if we defeat transnational corporate power on something they want so badly, to create the rules for themselves. This was negotiated in secret, except 600 corporate lawyers had access to the secret. And the Congress didn't, media didn't, we didn't, but they had live access on their computer. They could actually edit and give advice to the U.S. trade rep to put those edits in. So this is written by, and for the corporations. And so if we defeat the TPP, the European one's already having trouble. That'll make that harder, and then TISA will have almost no chance. So TPP is the kind of the head that we have to stop. So the three things are TISA, flush the TPP, check out the action page, and sign up for our, there's a pledge on TPP that you're going to help to fight it. Sign up for that, and you can then get a weekly email. And if you want to join a weekly conference call, we actually have had a weekly conference call with anywhere from 50 to 150 people on it each week. Talking about next steps and let people share ideas, because it's very much a bottom-up movement.
Thank you. Ruth.
Zeese, Kevin.
If you can't hear, I'll repeat.
I'll try to finish the hour. My daughter is a lawyer, and she works for the AFL.
Her daughter's a lawyer.
AFL-CIO. I'll repeat it too, don't worry. Go ahead.
So she's assistant to Farrell, who's the vice president of the AFL-CIO.
Okay,
I had a conversation with him
good.
about the TV. The AFL-CIO went back and forth with the Obama administration, really fighting over this trade deal. What he said to me was, you know how Pearson is a foreign company that has contract for the testing in the United States? One of the reasons why we can't get rid of the testing is because the secret clause that they have is that the company that has a contract with the U.S. and the U.S. breaks that contract, they can sue the U.S. in world court.
That's
right.
And so that's the reason why.
Okay. Yeah, the question was about her daughter who works at the AFL-CIO, and she was talking about the way that corporations can sue in a trade tribunal if a law or rule is changed. And this is one of the biggest problems in all of the, I don't know about how it works in this case, but generally on these trade agreements, especially on TPP, broadens it. It gives corporations the power to sue in these fake courts, trade tribunals, where the judges are 3 corporate lawyers on leave temporarily from their corporate job, serving as judges, and corporations can sue governments, the federal government, for the loss of profits that they expected to make before a law was put in place to protect the public interest, whether it's to protect workers, whether it's to protect the environment or communities, wages, whatever the issue is. They can then sue, and we've had some interesting law. You may have seen the lawsuit that came in recently was by TransCanada, the oil company that's suing for the KXL because it was stopped. They're now suing in these trade tribunals under NAFTA. They're suing in the trade tribunal in order to get their profits back. We've seen lawsuits against country of origin labeling under NAFTA, where Mexico and Canada sued us because our label said that food came from Mexico and Canada, and they didn't like that. I don't know what they're hiding, but they actually won. And so we had to change that law and remove that label, so you'll no longer know where your meat comes from. There's also a lawsuit that's working its way through right now on the dolphin safe tuna labeling, and we're losing that as well. So far we've lost that. And so it could change that whole labeling. So we're losing, basically what I'm telling you is, we're losing our legislative power. to pass laws in the public interest because these courts can overrule what's done. And the second point is, these courts cannot be reviewed by our courts. So the U.S. Supreme Court cannot overrule this trade tribunal of 3 corporate lawyer judges. So our courts are being decimated by this. This is a whole change in global governance. And in fact, I just want to mention one other thing to you. Coming out of the World Economic Forum, there's a project that's reviewing global governance that's trying to end the power of the nation state and grow the power of the corporations. They want to turn the UN into a hybrid of corporations and governments. They want to shrink the nation state's power because nations have to listen to people. They get slow. They can't make decisions quickly. Corporations can be very efficient and make decisions. They can move from country to country depending on where the best workers or cheapest workers, where the best, cheapest resources are. So this is something that they're actually thinking about. We talk about the end game. The end game is to shrink democracy to nothing, disempower legislatures, disempower courts, and make nation states less powerful than corporations. And I think the TPP is really a global corporate coup. It is really a coup to give greater power to corporations than nations have.
It sounds like the Endgame is an Isaac Asimov novel or Fahrenheit 451, if you really want to think about it. I'll get some of the questions. The lady in the white sweater, I think?
Yeah, hi.
Right.
I just would like to know, when you say corporations, it gets me crazy because there has to be a face, there has to be a name. We need to be able to target who they are. Can you give us 5 people to go after somehow?
Well,
Just 5? All right.
Anybody? Bess, you want to start? You got a couple of nominees? We'll give you more than 5.
Well, our friends at Walmart, the Waltons, Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. I mean, they're behind everything that we're fighting in
that's
this
right.
country.
That's right.
Pearson, who else?
The Kochs
The
and
Koch brothers.
the heads
Or
of
do you
Bank of
mean-
America, heads of J.P. Morgan.
Wait, I want to say something.
Actually, anybody Hillary Clinton has given a speech to.
Wait a minute.
In fact, one of the
Wait.
Walton kids just gave Hillary $350,000 for her PAC. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm standing because I'm so short you wouldn't be able to see me. So I don't mean to be standing, giving myself any more status here. But I think people don't realize that back in 1989, the National Business Roundtable dreamed up what has happened to our education system. There's a reason we're calling this a corporate-driven reform movement. Corporations are now destroying any chance for democracy, not in our own country, not only in our own country, but around the world. We have got to stop equating what we've all been brainwashed to believe, which is capitalism and democracy go hand in hand. Corporations are destroying any chance for democracy, and we have to speak to people about it and explain this. The TTP is like the biggest threat to democracy that they've ever dreamed up, and it's only going to get worse. And I'm going to sit down now.
Yeah, if you want to go back historically, Italian fascism was a partnership between the fascist party and their corporate leaders. So we can have other things. We have about 5 minutes left. Stephen?
My question is, if these corporate courts only have authority because we ceded to them in a trade agreement, how can they enforce their judgments? I mean, if we don't want to listen to them, we don't, what can they possibly do?
Well, usually they enforce their judgments with big fines. And then they enforce their judgments by forcing countries out of the inability to make these trade deals. So undermines the ability of countries to have trade. That's how they enforce it. They have that power to enforce it that way.
Yes, right there, the black shirt.
Years ago, I took a workshop with the American Friends Service Committee called Women and the Global Economy. And that's why I understand what you're talking about. Then we were working on NAFTA. And it was a popular education model. Are there certain structures that you suggest we use in our communities? Can you direct us to those resources so that we can bring groups together so they can connect the dots?
The great thing about this is, I didn't want to speak first. Anyone else want to speak? The great thing about, and the most problematic thing about these trade agreements is they affect everything. food and water, safety of food, healthcare, labor rights, environmental, climate. You pick the issue, it's affected by this. So what we've created in this fight to stop the TPP is what we call a movement of movements. So you can almost go to anyone active on any political issue in your community, and it adversely affects them. If you go to Flush the TPP, on the front page we have these slides, and they deal with the specific issues that are affected by the TPP. So that would be a good place to start to get the ideas about it, various segments of our society and our economy. But it affects everything. So movement of movements is the way to go. And I think the same thing, United Opt Out. Education affects everyone too. So I think the potential of this movement is barely scratching the surface. You're doing great work. That's not a criticism, because you really are doing great work. But the potential is really enormous.
Now, we can be the hub of the wheel. We really work at it. The walking man, Jesse.
If we want targets, then we look at the Koch brothers. Well, that's 40 paper towels. That's 60 cups. That's 60 plates. That's who they are. Every time we buy them, we support them. Every time we walk into Walmart, we support them. So it would be good for us to have, as that young lady said, give us 5 corporations. But I say give us 5 products. Give us 10 products. Give us 15. Tell us who they are, and we will buy them.
We've got time for one more.
Well, just you'll see on our webpage a boycott.
Netflix.
Hang on.
Netflix supports Travis.
Could you say that, repeat it this way so we can hear it up front?
There's an app that you can download free. It's called Boycott, B-U-Y-C-O-T-T. And on
B-U-Y-C-O-T-T.
And on this app, you do your profile of all your causes. Now, I happen to be very much against GMOs, so Monsanto is the devil. And on my phone, when I go shopping, I bring it up. Every single SKU, I put it on there. It tells me whether it's who it's owned by, what they're hurting, and then you, as I said, you can interact with it. Tell it if you bought it, if you didn't buy it, if you want your senator to know. But it's an excellent app, B-U-Y-C-O-T-T, and that can take you to the supermarket. And that's the way we're going to make a difference. Is bottom line is the money.
Right. Well, let me just quick point on Flush the TPP under actions. One of our actions is a boycott, where you buy intentionally buy local, buy organic, buy fair trade, and so that's a long-term campaign. But that's the money does talk, and we need to use it more effectively.
We wanted to come out of here with solutions, and what better way to deal with this capitalistic issue but with consumerist power? That's a great suggestion, sir. Last comment.
I was just going to suggest before we leave here today, we need to identify 3 major products that we can start initiating a boycott of those big 3 right away and start with Express. Well, that's one, but I'm talking about 3 that we can really target. Think in terms of when we were boycotting for South Africa against apartheid. There were specific things that everybody just about got on board with. I think people, when they're thinking of these things, they need just 3 specifics or 2 specifics. And I think if we start there and then build from there, it will go. So before we leave here, 2 or 3 specific products, like Kimberly Clark paper top, whatever, which is 3
Microsoft is a tough one.
It's a tough one, but we can stop.
Another one is Netflix, who's a big supporter of charter schools.
This is being live streamed, we know that. A moment of comedy brought to you by McDermott. So can we please thank our wonderful panel again? Thank you all. And please note, the conversation doesn't end here, it just gets started here. But we do have to move on because we have 3 breakout sessions happening again. So, for those of you who want to opt out 101 and competency-based education, please stay in this room. For those of you who want to talk about resisting charter takeover and school closure, please go to the North America room behind us. And for those of you interested in media and messaging and how you can be a part of the revolution, you are in the Europe room across from the little lounge area. Then we are back in here at 3 o'clock for another panel and in our final keynote.
Great comments. Thank you very much. That's a great book too. You'll enjoy it. We are both.
101 is spiritual.
Yeah.